Ladies and ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're based. It's all very relative, as we discussed. Today, with us, we have Nick Harvey, who's the CEO of the European Movement UK. Prior to that, and concurrently, he's chair of the advisory board at Impact and Influence. He's a consultant in communication strategy, policy, and governance. Has served as an associate at Global Partners Governance, was the chief executive officer for the Liberal Democrats, the director and then chair of the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, an MP for North Devon, and of course, most importantly, the Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom. So, Minister of the Armed Force for the United Kingdom. He should be joining us shortly. I hope we have a very lucrative conversation. And I hope, most importantly, you guys enjoy this. Nick, thanks for joining. It's a great pleasure having you here and quite a little bit of an honor. I know we go a little bit way back, so I've worked with you a couple of times. So for me, it's a little bit sentimental having you. I've gone ahead and described a little bit about your background, but the floor is yours. I want you to take it upon you and sort of introduce yourself to the world.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. I'm Nick Harvey. I was for many years a Liberal Democrat politician, a member of Parliament in the UK. I represented North Devon, which is a rural community and one that's quite economically challenged. I served as the Minister for Defence in the coalition government, 2010, the David Cameron government. Like many of my party, I was part of a wipeout in 2015, from which I'm pleased to say we've now recovered, and I am tilling the soil elsewhere. I spent some years working in international development, helping with capacity building and training and mentoring politicians and ministers in developing countries after I came out of the UK Parliament. Nowadays, I am the chief executive in London of the European Movement in the UK. This is the organisation that was formed by Churchill and the other post-war leaders to promote unity and harmony between the peoples and nations of Europe. So we were very active back at the beginning in framing and creating the European Convention on Human Rights. We then spent a couple of decades lobbying to help get the United Kingdom into the EEC. And since the 2016 Brexit fiasco, we are now embarked in the same thing, in a sense, all over again, working and lobbying to get the UK back into Europe for the future.
Do you think that's going to happen?
I do. I couldn't necessarily tell you exactly when, but definitely progress is all going in the right direction. We have a different sort of a government since last year. The previous Conservative administrations doubled down on the mistake of Brexit by taking a very distant relationship with our European neighbours and partners. They made Brexit worse by the way they went about things. The new government has its heart in the right place. It is in favour of closer relations with Europe. It's trying to rebuild some of those connections and repair some of that damage. Progress is cautious, and it's just one step at a time. But we had an EU-UK summit in May, which was very successful, agreed a lot of practical steps that can be taken towards rebuilding the relationship. There'll be another summit at the same time next year and every year thereafter, and I just hope that bit by bit we will get on to better and more normalised terms with our European partners. It's costing the UK an absolute fortune being out of the European market, and the sooner we can improve access and ultimately get back into it, the better the chances of stimulating economic growth and getting the public monies back into a better state, which is what the poor Chancellor Rachel Reeves is grappling with. Labour came in a year ago inheriting a flat economy, public finances that were bare, and public services that were broken after 15 years of austerity. And they're finding it very difficult. And the sooner we can get back closer into our trading links with Europe, the better the prospects of more growth, more tax receipts, more investment, and a better quality of living for everyone.
Okay, okay, that's certainly a point in your argument. I don't want to be the devil's advocate, but I'm kind of forced to. What about the rising numbers of things like Reform UK and people that want to stay out of the European Union and keep this splendid isolationism that, well, the Commonwealth isolationism that the UK has adopted?
It's an interesting point. You're quite right that Reform are enjoying a period of ascendancy at the moment. They're doing well in opinion polls. That's, well, the difference between that and actually winning power, but they're in a good place at the moment. However, when you start probing down into that opinion polling, you discover that a third of people who are saying they would vote for reform want to go back into the EU. And they're fed up with politics, they're fed up with the Conservatives, they're fed up with Labour, they're fed up with inflation and the cost of living, and they think that the simplistic solutions that Nigel Farage and Reform are offering may be part of the solution, but for a third of them at least, they actually want to go back into the EU. So I don't know to what extent really this rise in Reform's popularity has got anything to do with the European issue at all. I think it's symptomatic of just people being pretty fed up.
The whole situation. Do you think
Yeah.
it would make more sense a little bit for the politicians to address the situation, the economics of it? I don't know, potentially their voices for migration, cost of living, et cetera, vis-a-vis just looking into joining the EU or staying out of it. So my thing is, do you think perhaps you should have a more diverse agenda?
Well, I don't think that our organisation should, because we exist for that one single purpose. But I think actually the point you're
Sorry, I
making.
meant you as politicians by default.
Well, to be truthful, the political agenda in the UK isn't very much focused on the European question at the moment. People like me might prefer that it were rather more focused on it, but it's not. I mean, the government knows that people are first and foremost fed up with the cost of living. They're trying to take practical steps to improve that. I think the point I'm simply making is that actually they could do more about that if there were fewer trade barriers between ourselves and our most lucrative market that happens to be right next door to us. So the two things do go hand in hand, but actually, in fairness to the government, and I'm not of the same political persuasion, they are focused on these bread and butter issues, but it's very, very difficult. They inherited a mess, as I have said, and in a sense, they rather made it worse by ruling out tax rises or increased borrowing, which would have been two of the obvious levers they could have pulled to try and do something about it. The third being improving relations with the European market, which they've ruled out for the time being in a fundamental sense as well. So they've made things more difficult for themselves, but we're only 1 year into a 5-year parliament. There's plenty more they can do yet, and Liberal Democrats, that's my party, have made the mistake before of counting chickens before they're hatched and thinking that early opinion poll leads in the middle of a parliament are going to turn into power, and then they don't. So if Reform are wise, they won't be taking anything for granted at the moment.
How would your organization be able to cooperate with a conservative government if a conservative government comes into power, or potentially even Reform coming into power if they
Yeah,
come into
I
power?
mean, it's a good question that you raise, and I'm always making it clear to our members that we need the Conservative Party ultimately to get back into a sensible place on the European issue. I mean, historically, our organisation was full of Conservatives. It was British Conservatives who wrote the European Convention on Human Rights. It was British officials who framed a lot of the things that have come into being over the past 75 years by way of European institutions. It was the Conservative Party who took the UK into the EEC back in the 1970s. And actually, I mean, just a little bit more recent history, in 2016, when the Brexit referendum took place, the Conservative Party officially was for staying in. Far more of its MPs voted to stay in than to come out. They just seem to have lost their way a little bit since then. The problem we've got is that if at some point in the future a Labour government knocks on the door in Brussels and says, we want to come back in, but the Conservatives, as the opposition, are still saying, yes, but if we win the next election, we'll take the UK right back out again, then we're doomed to failure. The EU, quite rightly, would not want to renew what I call the in out, shake it all about psychodrama in the UK. They'll only really take us back when there's something of a political consensus about it. So the Conservatives have got a tricky strategic decision to make. If they tack to the right to try and triangulate with reform, they're leaving an awful lot of ground on their centre flank, which the Liberal Democrats in particular, I think, will soak up and take more parliamentary seats from them. On the other hand, if they tack back into the centre to fight the Lib Dems, then maybe they fear that Nigel Farage will run amok on the right. However, they can't really do both things at once, no matter how hard they might try to. And all history shows that ultimately you have to tack back into the centre in order to win, because that is where elections are won from. I suspect the Conservatives are going to have to take an electoral defeat or two before they come to their senses. But in the meantime, there are lots of individuals within our Conservative Party who are very sensible on this European issue. And actually, interestingly, younger members of the Conservative Party tend to be very sensible on it as well, and are just biding their time waiting for some of the dinosaurs who are obstructive on all of this to vacate the scene. So I haven't given up on the Conservative Party. I think that ultimately they will come back to a centre position. They are pragmatic. They want to win elections, and that's the way they'll win them. So eventually we'll get them back on side. As for reform, I think that's more difficult. I mean, I think they are fundamentally contrarians. I don't think they are really ever going to try and appeal to the majority and to the centre ground. And there's probably really nothing we can do much to work with them. Coming back to your original starting point, there isn't an awful lot in common between people like ourselves who are internationalists and believe in the values that we share with Europe, and those like reform who you can see in other countries in Europe and, of course, in the Trump movement in America, are really on a totally different wavelength. And it's very difficult to see how you cooperate with people like that at all.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. That's a very good point as well. I think they would argue the same on for the Labour Party or even the Conservatives. So it's a two-way street, but I get your point completely. Let me ask you something. In terms of the EU, what do you think would be the terms for UK rejoining the EU this time around? Do you think it would come, for example, with adopting the currency? Or something of that sort? Do you think the terms are going to be as flexible and as good as they were the first time around, or do you think you're going to have some tough love to deal with the Europeans?
Yeah, I think there'll be an element of tough love. I don't think we can seriously expect to go back in on the terms that we had before, and we're certainly not going to be able to negotiate the budget rebate that we had
Mm-hmm.
previously. on some of those specific issues, I mean, on the currency, I don't know.
It would make more sense for me for the Europeans, for example, to pressure that this time around the UK would come back with the euro rather than
Yeah, I
pound.
don't know. I mean, there are countries in the European Union that are not making any steps to join the euro. Um, and the EU doesn't seem to me to do anything particularly to pressurize them into it. And I don't know what they'd even think about the UK being in the euro. I just have a sense that we might have to agree in principle that we were on a long-term pathway towards it. But I can't see anybody in Europe going to too much length to try and get us into it.
So you
That
don't think
said,
a potential rejoining would be? I mean, there would be some tough love, but it wouldn't be punitive on the side of
I
the EU.
don't think so. No, I don't think the euro will be a deal breaker. I don't think Schengen will be either, because some of the island members of the EU aren't in Schengen anyway. Doesn't the whole principle of Schengen doesn't particularly lend itself to islands geography? I'm not sure they'd even let us into Schengen, much less force us to. But I mean, I have no particular objection to Schengen in principle. So I mean, we could see where that got to come the time. But the one thing I think we absolutely cannot get around, there is no possibility of diluting this, and that is free movement of people, because the Treaty of Rome, the basis on which the EU is founded, has as an absolute fundamental principle free movement of goods, capital, and labour, people looking for work. And you can't get round that. It's not divisible. It's not something that the EU could compromise on. So I think there's a long-term challenge for people like me who want to go back into the EU to try and convince our fellow British citizens that freedom of movement was and can again be a good thing. It represents real opportunity for us to go and live and work and settle in other European countries. And of course, it's two-way traffic. So Europeans come here too, but that's really good for our economy and our supply of labour. And they've always tended to be young, fit, healthy people coming here to try and work. And we're missing not having that pool of labour available to us at the moment. It's difficult trying to sell that message when you've got nationalists and right wingers out there pushing horrid, racist, xenophobic, anti immigrant messages. We can see this going on. It's nothing uniquely British. We can see this sort of politics in many, if not most, other countries of the world. But if you've got to stick to your principles and argue your case and hope that people in the end have the sense to see the benefits of it. It's very much in the interests of UK PLC to get back to the situation of having free movement of people.
Well, Nick, I mean, I agree with you. I've always seen politics as something that sort of synthesizes from multiple policies. You could be a centrist and draw some policies from the left, some policies from the right, depending on
Yeah.
what suits you best. So a lot of synthesis is kind of the way I see practical politics. And that brings me to my question, which is one of originally how I wanted to start this interview, but I guess I got sidetracked a little bit. What drew you into politics in the first place? Was there a moment, a book, a person, something that sort of you mentioned Churchill in the beginning, and Churchill is not only a UK treasure, but I think a European treasure. So, I mean, what drew you into politics to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, a busybody instinct, a desire to be involved. I'd rather be on the field of play than watching in the stands. And I sort of came of age around about 1979, 1980. We'd had a Labour government in the 70s in the UK that had failed, really. We had Thatcher just starting her period of reign, going about things in a very heavy-handed way, laying waste to great chunks of British industry and causing a huge amount of social unrest and division. And I just thought there really has to be a better way than either of these. And the Liberal Party and the alliance that it formed with the Social Democrat Party in the UK seem to offer something new and different and more forward-looking and more positive, and that's how I came to be involved in it. Now, things have taken a lot longer to sort of build and get to where I would like them to be than back then. As a young person, I had hoped that they would do, but I don't regret getting involved or my choice of path. We've been a source for good in the intervening decades, but it is just frustrating how slow things are.
How hard was it for you to go through the process of getting elected
Yeah, they say
this
in
time
Brit
around?
they say in Britain that the average length of time between forming a sincere ambition to be a member of Parliament and getting there is 13 years. And that was probably about right in my case, too. It depends, the pathway is slightly different depending which party you're in. In the Liberal Democrats, I would say historically it's been relatively easy to be chosen as a candidate. The much more difficult challenge is turning that candidature into something that can potentially win. The
Mhm.
work comes after you've been selected as the candidate, trying to turn the community that you're trying to represent round to your point of view. If you're in the Labour or Conservative parties in the UK, typically there are huge swathes of seats that will almost always go one way or the other. And so the scrabble is to be one of the candidates for your party in one of those safe-ish seats, thanks to our very undemocratic voting system. In the 650 seats in Parliament, about 500 of them never change hands. So if you can get yourself selected in one of those 500 for one of the old parties, you're going to be there for a very long time. So it's ultra competitive to get
Mhm.
the selection as the candidate. So a young person with an ambition in the Liberal Democrats can become the candidate relatively easy and then has to spend long years pounding the doorstep. In the Conservative or Labour parties, it's much more difficult to get chosen as the candidate, but once you are, you've got a much better prospect of being elected as an MP. So the work tends to have to go on within your party, grubbing around and getting noticed and getting sort of people to be your sponsors and patrons and back you and support you in order to get picked as a candidate. But whichever of those two routes you take, it seems to work out around about 13 years between harbouring the ambition
Good
and
challenge.
fulfilling it by getting yourself elected to Parliament.
So, you served as a minister of the armed forces during a pretty tense time, both for the UK and the global arena. So, I mean, what was your experience with that role? What did it teach you? How was it as an experience?
It was great. It was exhilarating. It was fascinating. I mean, it was incredibly hard work. I could be called out of bed at all times of the night to approve some military action or another. And it involved traveling to many different parts of the world to see what the British Armed Forces were doing, to negotiate with the governments whose territories we were operating in Afghanistan when we were handing prisoners over to the Afghan authorities. I had to go and inspect prisons and so on. I mean, it was a hugely diverse job, and I enjoyed doing it. Unfortunately, ultimately, my party bosses decided that however good a job I was doing in it, there weren't any party political runs in it. So we traded that role away halfway through the coalition. But I mean, I think that's a shame because I think it was important work. and I enjoyed doing it and was doing it well. And it was a fascinating time, as you say. There were the tail end of the Iraq conflict. Afghanistan was still going flat out. There was then all the business with Libya, and shortly after I left were all the issues with whether or not to get involved in Syria. So it was a very, very lively time to be involved in defence. Yeah.
Was there a particular point during your appointment that you felt like you couldn't do this anymore, or a specific event that really shocked you? That you thought, of
No,
course, this.
there was never a point where I didn't think I could do it, but I remember the first time I was asked to approve bombing targets, finding that quite a, well, I would say hair raising, but I don't have any hair. But I mean, uh, you had to think long and hard and deep about that, and the quality of the advice that was on hand was supremely high. There were lawyers, there were ethicists, there were military advisors. I would say the British Armed Forces are extremely thoughtful in the way they go about things, and the quality of military personnel and indeed of officials at the Ministry of Defence was extremely high, and I had the highest of respect for the people I was working with.
Fair enough. Let me ask you something else. Looking back at your years in Parliament, and looking at UK politics today, what do you think is fundamentally broken with UK politics, other than people having their seats for forever in the two big parties? Do you think, for example, it's the fact that young people don't get enough of I don't know, capabilities or options or seats, or are not trusted? What is it for you that you would fix in UK politics today?
Pretty much everything. I mean, the fact that we have the sort of nerve to go out trying to export the Westminster model of government, and some of the countries in the British Commonwealth have adopted some aspects of it, is a bit chilling, really. I mean, one of the things that fascinates me is that in the aftermath of World War II, Germany, having been defeated, was initially put on the path to reconstruction by the victors who took over the German territory. And all the things that we put in place for the Germans were good and were well thought through and have done the German state an awful lot of good in the 80 years since then. So a much better voting system, much more devolution of power to a local level, workplace trade unions rather than great big industry-wide ones. I mean, all the things that were put in place afterwards were far better than what we got here. And I found myself at one point giving advice in one developing country, and one of the government ministers said to me, "I hope you're not just trying to sell us the British system of doing things," to which I replied, "Good God, no, we can do a lot better for you than that." So, I mean, there is an awful lot wrong. There really is. We are the most centralized of the world's democracies. It's absolutely ludicrous the extent to which everything is micromanaged from London. The voting system is ridiculous. There's a complete lack of response or sensitivity to what the public are saying and wanting. So young people who do start campaigning on issues are as bemused and frustrated as I was 45 years ago to discover that outside of an election time, which only comes once every 5 years, the British political system just doesn't respond or give a heck about what the public are thinking. Now, I don't know that there's any system that's perfect, but I do think that other countries have got this in a better place, and that
I'd argue that Switzerland's system is a little bit more transparent.
yes, I mean there are different models that can work, but if you've got meaningful dispersal of power to different levels, that helps. If it's not, it's sort of shit or bust here. You either win everything or you win nothing. Whereas in other countries where it's more dispersed, you can work at things incrementally and begin to make some progress. And here it's just all or nothing. Eh, it's always astonishing to foreign leaders to see quite how much power a British Prime Minister has, because they've almost got all of the power and no one else has kind of got any. It's a very, very hierarchical system, even to this day.
Okay, okay. You mentioned that you consulted with a couple of other leaders across the scene. I'm not going to ask you where or whom or what that was, but was there any context within what they were trying to build for their country that impressed you or surprised you or saw it made you see things different?
Yeah, I mean, I was doing some work in Egypt, and I was quite intrigued the extent to which the adoption of social media was faster in the aftermath, well, during and in the aftermath of the Arab Spring than
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in the West. And I actually ended up going back to the UK with quite interesting and innovative ideas on how to use electronic media in politics, because I think they were actually ahead of us at that stage. I've seen other things that have quite impressed me. I mean, I went and monitored some elections in Armenia and concluded that they were being better run than ours were. So
Really?
yeah, I mean, it's not unusual that you find some aspects of things elsewhere that are interesting and new and different and would be capable of being adapted to use in different countries.
What about because you gave the example of Egypt, and I think that's across the Middle East. Do you think that there's anything that's sort of misunderstood from the West in potential political reform in the Middle East, North Africa region, or the concept of exporting democracy, which I personally think it has gone full cycle and we're no longer discussing that. But do you how do you see these governments? These some would call authoritarian, I call necessary, other people call fragile. So how do you see these governments, and how do you see sort of the West's interpretation of these governments?
I mean, I think in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, probably too many people in the West thought, this is the opportunity to get all of those countries functioning with a Western style democracy. And it hasn't worked out like that. Bluntly, it was never going to. And these were probably unrealistic expectations in the first place. So I think sometimes a little more humility is called for on the part of Western interlocutors. I think that nevertheless, we should try to articulate values of genuine commitment to democracy, to the rule of law applying equally to everyone, to an international rules-based system, to global action to tackle climate change and migrations of people and pandemics and so on. I mean, I think there are universal values and commitments that we should try to encourage everyone to adopt and to follow. But we do just have to understand that it's taken centuries to get to where we are, which is still, in any case, far from perfect. And other countries will do their own thing at their own pace. Now, when there's terrible things going on in the world and governments are mistreating people, then yes, by all means, you call it out, as increasingly people are having to at the moment. in respect to what's happening in Gaza. But by and large, we should focus on those sort of principles and values and not be telling other countries in prescriptive terms how they should be going about running themselves.
Let me ask you something. There's a lot of voices about Gaza. There's nothing about what's happening in Syria currently by the government forces. What do you think some issues are? I don't want to say hotter because it sounds a little bit inconsiderate, but why do you think some issues are addressed more by civil society other than others?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't got an answer to your question. I suppose we know more about what's going on in Gaza because everyone, even though international journalists aren't allowed in, the pictures that do come out are just so gruesome and grotesque that understandably there's a lot of angst about it. Now, I'm quite sure you're right in saying that some bad things are happening in Syria, but we do know less about it. And I suppose ignorance, therefore, is part of the reason that we're not so focused on that. Um, I mean, when the action in respect to maltreatment of the Druze took place, it was all a revelation to me. I didn't know anything about that prior to that happening.
Okay, okay. I think that kind of wraps it up on my side. I won't take too much of your time. It's also summer, so I completely understand. I do have some couple question, a few more questions, then they're more like reflective and wisdom based. So, so my first one to you is you've been at the center of politics, global development, civil society for quite some time. What is the biggest lie about power, the biggest myth about power?
Hmm. I mean, I can't remember who it was. There was some American politician who said every time I climb another rung up the ladder, power seems to be further away. And in a sense, that's definitely been my experience. If you've got absolute power, then there is something quite fundamentally wrong. And I suppose when we see the sort of things that Donald Trump seems to be doing in America, he seems to be playing fast and loose with the constitutional checks and balances that are supposed to exist in the American Constitution. He wants to have control of all the organs of governance, and that just isn't what the founding fathers of the USA intended or wrote their constitution to say. So it's a difficult one. I remember when we were doing workshops in Egypt for political parties, the Muslim Brotherhood sent representatives to the workshops, and I sat down and spent time with them. And I said, "Look, guys, you've got an election coming up. If you win, that does entitle you to do these things, but it would not entitle you to do those things." And they seemed very receptive to it at the time. So they were either stringing me along or they just weren't able to convince their colleagues when they went back to HQ, because they did win the election and then tried to do a complete power grab in almost a Donald Trump sense. And then they got ousted again, not that much later. So I think if I've got a sort of overall view, it's that if you crave absolute power, you're never really going to get it other than as a complete absolute dictator. And even that doesn't last forever. And you're better to just settle for part of the thing and to do it as well as you can.
Okay. My second question to you, because you mentioned the US and you mentioned Egypt and you mentioned reforms in general. Do you believe democracy is outdated? Do you believe a system that's closer to a republic or a Swiss type of democracy? So again, in my strictly theoretical perspective, a republic again. Do you think a republic system is more than ever needed in the global arena?
I don't think democracy is dead by any stretch of the imagination. Um, I mean, I think there are some things we can only do on an international basis, and the international institutions can try and espouse democratic values, but they're not in and of themselves democracies. So there is an element of negotiation and power plays involved in anything really. But no, I haven't given up on democracy. It's an imperfect system, but as Churchill said, it's better than all the rest. So, but I think one has to be realistic and not be too purist about it, and not disdain or refuse to work with countries and people that are practicing things that may not be quite your model of democracy, but nevertheless may be working for some sort of common good.
Okay. What keeps you optimistic or motivated to continue working till today in politics?
I mean, ultimately, I do feel in the course of my lifetime that progress has been made. I mean, I think there's greater understanding of and awareness of global challenges and climate change and the sort of imbalances between the global south and the north, and the need to address those or suffer the consequences in both halves. So although it's frustrating and sometimes you get quite serious reversals, nevertheless, my sense is that things painfully and erratically do continue broadly to move in the right direction, and therefore it's worth continuing to try and contribute to that and make it happen. But I mean, when you get absurd acts of self damage like Brexit or the Americans re-electing Donald Trump, you do wonder what the world is coming to. But we just have to keep ploughing away and working for the principles that I hope bind us together.
And with this, I'd like us to wrap it up. My last question to you is: if you could go back in time and give your firstly elected 1992 self any piece of advice about the years that would come ahead, or if you want to give a young new politician coming into the scene now some words of advice, what would those words of advice be?
Um, just to try and get on with it and live for the day, and that you can tell from talking to me that I've got quite a strategic mind and I can take quite a long-term view of everything, but you can take that too far and assume that you've got more time than you have. So young men in a hurry can worry me, but on balance, I still respond quite well to young people who are vigorous and are trying to go about things and change the world. So I think my advice to the young ones is crack on and get on with it. And you'll make mistakes, but you learn from mistakes and just sort of pick yourself up and go again.
Even if it means taking down dinosaurs?
Oh, yes. Dinosaurs will have to be taken down at every twist and turn.
Good. Good. I agree. Okay, Nick. I think with this, I'll wrap it up. Those are wise words to finish this up with. I don't want to take too much of your time as well. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this for me, with me. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Nick Harvey, the one and only true legend. I'll pop a link to your movement as well if anybody needs some
Yes,
details. We
do.
can take it from there. Good.
Okay,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Alex. Good to talk to
Thank
you.
you.
Cheers.
Likewise. Bye bye.